Today I want to return to Augustine's Confessions. Let's look at Book 2 on his adolescence. The most remarkable incident in this book, the most famous incident, is his stealing the pears, what he considers his greatest sin. And that's where I want to concentrate myself in this talk. But first, let's note something remarkable that happens right at the beginning. He says, "I intend to remind myself of my past foulnesses and carnal corruptions, not because I love them, but so that I may love you, my God. It is from love, of your love, that I make this act of recollection. The recalling of my wicked ways is bitter in my memory, but I do it so that you may be sweet to me, a sweetness touched by no deception, a sweetness serene and content. You gathered me together from the state of disintegration, in which I had been fruitlessly divided. I turned from unity in you to be lost in multiplicity." There's something very interesting, I think, happening here. This sense of disintegration, lost in multiplicity. A distinctly modern virtue, not discussed by any of the ancients, is integrity. We tend to think of integrity as a very important virtue, and sometimes we simply mean by that honesty. And there is an important element of integrity that I think does come down to honesty, but there's something else about integrity. Look at the word. Being integral, being one, being whole. We have the sense that a person of integrity is fully unified, is one being. They are not hypocritical, for example. They are not dishonest. But those are only dimensions of this. They are not lost in multiplicity. They are fully integrated, not disintegrated. And indeed, it's easy, perhaps easier in modern life than in earlier times, but I suspect even then, to feel disintegrated, to feel as if our lives are scattered. We pay attention to this, we pay attention to that. We're so driven by the day-to-day concerns of the world. And we're pulled in different directions by different obligations, by different relationships, by different kinds of jobs that we have to do. And all of that can mean it's very hard for us to stay centered, to retain an attitude of what in Eastern religions is often considered mindfulness. He's saying, Lord, I have felt lost in disintegration. I have felt as if I'm not living in mindfulness, but instead I'm lost in multiplicity. I want to regain that mindfulness. And so part of the reason he's confessing his sins and going through this process is to say, I want to regain, or maybe gain in the first place, that sense of mindfulness, of integration, of unity, as opposed to being lost in multiplicity. At one time in adolescence, I was burning to find satisfaction in hellish pleasures. I ran wild in the shadowy jungle of erotic adventures. We're tempted to read this and think, you're bragging now. But actually, no. He really does feel as if, look, he gave himself over to this and to a life of carnal pleasure from an early age, and it's something that he now regrets. Regrets because he now thinks of sex as sinful. Not necessarily. He doesn't think of desire as sinful. He doesn't think of sex as necessarily sinful, although he does see it as an obstacle to the kind of pursuit of God that he wants to engage in. But instead, he says, the problem is, well, being lost in multiplicity, being distracted by all the other things that can get in the way. It's one more and one immensely powerful thing that can get in the way of doing what is really your function, namely worshiping God, praising God, glorifying God. And so it is in that sense perhaps no worse than other worldly pursuits. Its worseness, its degree of being sinful, is really just a matter of the strength of its pull. You can be just as distracted by a job. You can be just as distracted by an attempt to make jokes, by all sorts of other pursuits. But on the other hand, it's one that tends for many people to be much more powerful than those things are. Now, the single desire that dominated my search for delight, and this I think is interesting. You would expect him perhaps to have this Platonic framework where he says, the appetitive element in my soul, or perhaps some Socratic idea of, well, my ignorance of you. That's not what he says. He says, the desire that dominated my search for delight was simply to love and be loved. Now, that's a very interesting way to put it. He's in love with the idea of love. He's in love with love and being loved. More so, you get the sense, than any particular person he might have loved or pursued. It wasn't just raw animal lust that he attributes this to, something like an appetitive element. It's a desire for love. It's the love of love itself. And the echo coming after that first paragraph where he talks about God as love. Not that I love sin, but that I may love you, God, who is love. That's something that suggests, look, even this has a kind of divine origin. God is love. And what was distracting him so much? It wasn't just an animal pursuit. It was the love of love and being loved. That's something that was driving him. That was something very powerful for him. And so there is an emotional element of this, and indeed even a divine spark behind this. It is no accident that mystics have often used sexual imagery when they talk about union with God and seeking union with God. There is a divine spark behind love, and that sense of the erotic is something that you might say ties together carnal love and a more abstract and a more divine love of God. All of those things have a kind of common element to them. And so he's at least saying, look, it wasn't just this thing that was, you might say, part of a purely bodily nature. It was something that was the whole of my being. And it in fact had this aspect to it, this spark behind it, that came from something higher. But he began living with someone from the age of 17 on, and in fact had a child with her, eventually separates from her when he decides that she's of lower class and incompatible with his pursuit of higher offices and a higher social standing. To us today, that seems monstrous. It was actually pretty commonplace at the time for someone of his and her statuses socially, but I'm not sure that makes it less monstrous. Both he and she, and I think the child, found this an immensely painful thing. And so to say it was something that was fairly common in that society at the time does not mean it was not psychologically a torment to everyone involved. I think it really was, and something that helps to spark, perhaps, his feelings of guilt over that relationship. If that's what was going to happen, really, was it right to even begin that relationship from the start? But whatever we might want to say about that, that is not something he considers his ultimate sin. Throughout this section, he describes and starts a number of paragraphs, wretch that I am. That should ring a bell. Paul, Romans 7, wretched being that I am. He's recalling Paul here and saying, I too feel that way. I do things that I don't want to do. I end up sinning even though I don't really want to sin. Emotionally, I feel terrible about doing it. I know what I ought to be doing, and yet I do it anyway. I am a wretch in Paul's sense, in that sense. Reason, emotion, desire are all on the side of leading me onto the right path, and somehow I fall astray and get led onto the wrong path. Wretch that I am, do I dare to say that you, my God, were silent, when in reality I was traveling farther from you? Well, God seemed silent during those years, but it wasn't because God wasn't there, not because God wasn't speaking. It's because he was traveling further away from God. He was turning his back on God. The famous passage. Theft receives certain punishments by your law, Lord, and by the law written in the hearts of men, which not even iniquity itself destroys. That idea of the law written in the heart is very important. Even though we do have an inherently sinful nature, also born in us is a need for God. Our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And also inherent in us, also inborn, is the law written in our hearts, a conscience that tells us, even apart from Scripture, that murder is wrong, that theft is wrong, that adultery is wrong, that coveting what someone else has is wrong. For what thief can with equanimity endure being robbed by another thief? This is something that later inspires Kant, who ends up saying, look, it isn't as if the thief is living by a different set of rules. They know what the rule is. They don't want to be robbed. The murderer doesn't want to be killed. And so, in fact, there isn't a different set of rules here. These are people who are making exceptions for themselves. That law is written in the heart already. He can't tolerate it even if he's rich and the other is destitute. I wanted to carry out an act of theft and did so, driven by no kind of need other than my inner lack of any sense of or feeling for justice. Wickedness filled me. I stole something which I had in plenty and of much better quality. My desire was to enjoy not what I sought by stealing, but merely the excitement of thieving and the doing what was wrong. And here's the story. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, laden with fruit, though attractive in neither color nor taste. To shake the fruit off the tree and carry off the pears, I and a gang of naughty adolescents set off late at night after, in our usual pestilential way, we had continued our game in the streets. We carried off a huge load of pears. But they were not for our feast, but merely to throw to the pigs. Even if we ate a few, nevertheless our pleasure lay in doing what was not allowed. Well, what's remarkable about this passage is that he's saying, look, we stole the pears, and you might expect that to be because there was a good there that we valued. We valued the pears. But actually, no, we didn't. We thought they weren't very tasty pears. They didn't even look very good. They didn't have a pleasing smell. There was nothing about them attractive. Remember, Eve in the Garden of Eden says, well, I looked at the fruit and it looked really good. And he's saying, these didn't look good. There was nothing attractive about these. In a way, this was worse than Eve's sin. Because at least the fruit on the tree looked attractive. At least the serpent said, eat, it will give you knowledge. In this case, there was nothing to be gained by taking that pear. It wasn't a good pear. He ended up throwing them largely to the pigs. And so why did he do it? Well, one analysis is there was no reason at all. Aristotle started the Nicomachean Ethics by saying every art, every action, every inquiry is aimed at some good. Maybe this is a counterexample. It's not aimed at any good at all. But there is a hint of a good here. Our pleasure lay in doing what was not allowed. We sought the excitement of thieving, and we wanted to do what was wrong. We did wrong for wrong's sake. Now that is a challenge to Aristotle, but in a slightly different way. Because the thought in Socrates, in Plato, and in Aristotle is that what we pursue, what we choose, is for the sake of some good. Something that we at least perceive to be good. Something we think of as good. Well, here, there appears to be no good at all, except the good of doing bad. Okay? And that's a very weird kind of good. I did it for the sake of being bad. I did it out of wickedness. I did it partly because of the thrill. And so you could say, indeed, the good here is the thrill, the pleasure, the excitement. And maybe that's the right analysis. But it's a weird kind of pleasure, because it's a pleasure at doing the wrong thing, a pleasure at wickedness, a pleasure at evil. And that's a surprising thing. And so if that can count as a good after which I seek, well, then it looks rather vacuous to say that every action aims at some good. After all, the good might be just the pleasure of doing bad, the pleasure of doing something for no reason at all. And indeed, that's what strikes a lot of people about this story. Stealing the pear was utterly gratuitous. Having the relationship with the woman he lived with from age 17 all the way up to age 32, that's 15 years of faithfulness with the same woman, having a child with her, but then dumping her? Isn't that a greater sin? Well, here's the thing. Those decisions were all made for a reason. They were all in the pursuit of something good. You could criticize the comparatives here and think that he went for the lesser as opposed to the greater good in any of these cases. But nevertheless, it was in pursuit of some good. It's intelligible. Stealing the pears feels unintelligible. These kids are out there, they've been playing these games, they're bored, and for no reason at all they go over and they steal the pears that are no use to them whatever. Such was my heart, O God, such was my heart. You had pity on it when it was at the bottom of the abyss. Now let my heart tell you what it was seeking there, that I became evil for no reason. I had no motive for my wickedness except wickedness itself. That idea of becoming evil for no reason, having no motive except wickedness itself, that's a very special category of sin. Indeed, some seminaries have special courses on this category of sin, because other sins aren't like this. Other sins we could think of as the pursuit of a lesser good rather than a greater good. We might think of them as reason being overcome by desire or emotion. We might think of them as reason, desire, and emotion being overcome by something else, but nevertheless something we perceive as good at the moment. We might think of ourselves as temporarily forgetting what we truly know. We might think of ourselves as making a mistake that turned out to be a serious mistake even though we didn't understand it at the time. We might understand being driven by some outside force, like an addiction. But he says this wasn't like any of those. I wasn't addicted to stealing pears. I wasn't a kleptomaniac. It wasn't a question of desire for the pears. I didn't want the pears. I threw them out. It wasn't emotion. It wasn't like the pears struck me with this emotion of, oh, they're beautiful. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't reason saying it would be a good thing to get the pears. It wasn't that I made some kind of confused mistake and now I realize, oh yeah, I thought these would be great, but they're not good. No, it was none of that. It was, if there was any reason at all, wickedness itself that was the reason. And that's a hard kind of thing to understand. That's why he says this is the worst sin. This is worse than anything else. Because everything else you could think, well, I can see from one point of view why someone would do it. And in this case, he thinks, I can't understand it. It was foul and I loved it, he says. I loved the self-destruction. I loved my fall. Not the object for which I had fallen, but my fall itself. My depraved soul leaped down from your firmament to ruin. I was seeking not to gain anything by shameful means, but shame for its own sake. I'm reminded of a line from F. Scott Fitzgerald. I don't want to regain my innocence. I want the pleasure of losing it again. And that's a bit what we have here. This pleasure in losing innocence. Not because, it opens up a new world of this or that for me, but purely because I lost my innocence. There was a pleasure in that wickedness by itself. And that's what makes it so bizarre, so strange, so hard to understand. In a sense, the furthest from God. Because it's not like seeking God and taking the wrong path. It's not like letting something else push me off the path toward God. It's like turning my back on God and laughing at the pleasure of turning my back on God. And he says that's why it was worse. Everything else is falling off the path. This was turning back purposely and going in the other direction and taking pleasure in that. That seems somehow worse. Here's how he ends up saying we might think of this. The life we live in this world has its attractiveness because of a certain measure in its beauty and its harmony with all these inferior objects that are beautiful. Human friendship is a nest of love and gentleness because of the unity it brings about between many souls. Yet sin is committed for the sake of all these things and others of this kind, when, in consequence of an immoderate urge toward those things which are at the bottom end of the scale of the good, we abandon the higher and supreme goods. That is you, Lord God, and your truth and your law. These inferior goods have their delights, but not comparable to my God who has made them all. It's in him that the just person takes delight. He is the joy of those who are true of heart. But that's what's so strange about the pair. He's thinking of a scale here, a scale of goodness, and he's thinking God is at the top of that scale. Everything else is below it, but they have their good too. And so one can see how someone would choose the lesser as opposed to the greater, would know the better and do the worse. The worse still has its attractiveness. It still has a certain kind of beauty and a certain kind of appeal. There would still be a reason to do it, and people make that choice of choosing the lesser as opposed to the better, knowing the better and choosing the worse all the time. Pears aren't like that. He didn't know the better and do the worse, and not because he didn't know the better. He did. He just chose the worst because it was the worst. There wasn't something that was a lesser good that he chose. Instead, he chose wickedness itself. He chose to jump off that scale altogether. And that is what makes this so bizarre, so unintelligible, so wicked from his point of view. Wretch that I was, what did I love in you, my act of theft, that crime which I did at night in the 16th year of my life? There was nothing beautiful about you, my thieving. Indeed, do you exist at all for me to be addressing you? I picked those fruits solely with the motive of stealing. I threw away what I had picked. My feasting was only on the wickedness which I took pleasure in enjoying. Now, Lord my God, I inquire, what was the nature of my pleasure in that theft? The act had nothing lovely about it. None of the loveliness found in equity and prudence, or in the human mind, whether in the memory, or in the senses, or in physical vitality. There was nothing good about it, and yet I took pleasure in it. That's the ultimate perversity. What on earth was good about stealing that fruit? He says, well, the theft itself was a nothing. But for that reason I was the more miserable. Yet had I been alone, I wouldn't have done it. I remember my state of mind to be thus at the time. Alone I would never have done it. Therefore my love in that act was to be associated with the gang in whose company I did it. Does it follow that I loved something other than the theft? No, nothing else in reality, because association with a gang is also a nothing. What is it in reality? Who can teach me that but he who illumines my heart? My pleasure was not in the pears, it was in the crime itself. done in association with a sinful group. In other words, he's saying this wasn't some kind of gang initiation. It wasn't because I wanted the social approval of my buddies. They said, let's do it. I thought, well, I don't want to be a square. It wasn't to be cool. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't anything that involved a social relationship. It is true that if they hadn't been there, I wouldn't have done it. But on the other hand, what I loved in it wasn't their approval or anything involving them. It was the theft itself. So in effect, he says, can this be an excuse for me? Not really. Not really. Admittedly, they were a causal factor. They were an enabler. Hadn't been for them, I wouldn't have done it. But they weren't the reason. They were merely an enabling condition. Yeah, they made it possible. But still, I chose it, and I chose it purely for the sake of the wickedness of the act. Well, what then, he asks, was my state of mind at the time? It was utterly shameful, and a disgrace to me that I had it. But what was it? Who understands his sins? Quoting Job. It was all done for a giggle, as if our hearts were tickled to think we were deceiving those who would not think us capable of such behavior, and would have profoundly disapproved. Why then did I derive pleasure from an act I would not have done on my own? Is it that nobody can easily laugh when alone? Well, that's true, but that doesn't seem an explanation. He says friendship can be a dangerous enemy, a seduction of the mind lying beyond the reach of investigation. Out of a game and a jest came an avid desire to do injury and an appetite to inflict loss on someone else, without any motive on my part of personal gain and no pleasure in settling a score. As soon as the words are spoken, let us go and do it. One is ashamed not to be ashamed. But what is that? Why am I now ashamed not to be ashamed? I should be ashamed. And it's shameful not to be ashamed. Who can untie this extremely twisted and tangled knot? It's a foul affair. I have no wish to give attention to it. I have no desire to contemplate it. But notice that question. Who can untie this extremely twisted and tangled knot? There's a theme in Paul that I think Augustine is here picking up, and becomes a very important theme throughout all of the Confessions and in the City of God as well. It's not just that we have an inherently sinful nature, and a nature that is inherently drawn toward God, our Creator, as the fulfillment of our ultimate function. It is that we don't understand ourselves. We are foreigners to ourselves. We are strangers to ourselves. There is something deep in us that we cannot understand, that makes no sense to us. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, others give us theories of the human condition to try to explain how weakness of will is possible, how it is possible for us to be led astray, to commit immoral actions, to sin. And he's saying, look, in the end, we're tangled knots. We can't untie ourselves. We can't understand it. There is something in us that leads us into this, that makes us delight even in wickedness itself for no other purpose. What is that? How can it be understood? In the end, he says, look, I can't understand it. I don't like to contemplate this because in the end it leads me up against a brick wall. I cannot figure out why I did this. I don't understand it. It makes no sense to me. And that idea that our own behavior makes no sense to us, that we are ultimately unintelligible to ourselves, intelligible only to God, is something that remains an important theme throughout this book and throughout his entire corpus of work.